Most Americans grow up hearing one simple sentence about Enoch, that he walked with God, and then was no more because God took him. Yet few realize that ancient Jewish tradition preserved a much deeper narrative surrounding his mysterious role. Within the book of Genesis, Enoch appears briefly in the genealogy before the flood, almost like a quiet interruption in a long list of names that many readers pass quickly without noticing anything unusual. Yet the wording surrounding Enoch stands out dramatically when compared with the rest of the genealogy, because the text emphasizes that he walked with God in a way no other figure in that list is described. That phrase alone sparked centuries of curiosity among ancient Jewish scholars who wondered why this one figure seemed to experience such an extraordinary relationship with the divine presence. In response to that curiosity, later Jewish writers developed a broader tradition about Enoch, portraying him as a witness to cosmic events that ordinary human beings could never see. The Book of Enoch presents him as a figure taken beyond the earth to observe heavenly realities, angelic hierarchies, and the unfolding judgment of rebellious forces that threatened the order of creation. Whether interpreted symbolically or historically, this narrative dramatically expands the short Genesis reference and attempts to explain why Enoch's story felt unfinished within the biblical genealogy. Ancient readers did not treat genealogies casually because lineage records often preserved cultural memory, identity, and theological reflection about how God interacted with humanity across generations. When Enoch appeared within that genealogy with such unusual language, it naturally provoked questions that later writers attempted to answer through expanded storytelling traditions. The Book of Enoch therefore functions less as a replacement for Genesis and more as an imaginative attempt to fill in narrative space surrounding a mysterious biblical figure. According to this expanded tradition, Enoch becomes a mediator between heaven and earth, receiving visions that reveal the moral state of humanity and the consequences of cosmic rebellion. These visions include descriptions of fallen angels, the corruption spreading across the earth before the flood, and the eventual judgment that would restore balance within the created order. For ancient audiences living in times of political instability and foreign domination, such narratives offered a framework for understanding why injustice seemed to flourish temporarily. The story suggested that even when corruption appeared overwhelming, divine justice was still unfolding beyond human sight within a larger cosmic timeline. In that sense, Enoch represented hope as much as warning because his journey revealed that hidden realities existed beyond immediate human experience. This imaginative expansion also reflects the intellectual environment of Second Temple Judaism. When apocalyptic literature flourished as communities sought meaning within turbulent historical circumstances, apocalyptic texts used vivid imagery to express theological convictions about divine sovereignty, moral accountability, and the ultimate restoration of order after periods of chaos. The Book of Enoch belongs to that literary world where symbolic visions carried deep moral messages rather than functioning as simple historical reports. Understanding that context helps modern readers appreciate why the narrative became influential among early Jewish and Christian communities without requiring literal interpretation of every described event. Early Christians were familiar with Enochic ideas because the themes of angelic rebellion and divine judgment echoed within the broader theological conversation of the first century. The New Testament itself reflects awareness of these traditions when discussing imprisoned angels, cosmic conflict, and the expectation of final justice. Yet over time, Western Christianity chose to emphasize a smaller set of canonical texts when shaping the official biblical collection used in most churches. This process gradually pushed the Book of Enoch outside regular teaching environments, even though fragments of the text survived and continued circulating in certain traditions. For American Christians centuries later, this meant that Enoch often appeared only as a brief, mysterious figure in Genesis, rather than as the central character of an expanded ancient narrative. When modern readers encounter the fuller Enoch tradition for the first time, the reaction is often surprise rather than skepticism, because the original Genesis reference already hints that something unusual surrounded this man. The idea that a figure could walk with God so closely that death itself was bypassed naturally invites deeper reflection about the spiritual significance of that relationship. Ancient writers responded to that curiosity by imagining what Enoch might have seen if he truly experienced direct access to divine realities beyond ordinary human perception. Whether one views these expansions as symbolic theology or speculative storytelling, they demonstrate how deeply the early Jewish imagination engaged with the mystery surrounding Enoch's brief biblical appearance. For many Americans today, discovering that such a tradition existed feels almost like uncovering a forgotten chapter of early religious thought. The surprise does not come from secret suppression, but from the simple fact that most church education focuses on the canonical text without exploring every historical tradition that developed around it. Yet when these traditions are examined responsibly, they provide valuable insight into how ancient communities wrestled with questions about justice, corruption, and the ultimate destiny of humanity. In that sense, the story of Enoch becomes more than a curiosity about a mysterious figure from Genesis, because it reflects the human search for meaning within a world that often appears morally unstable. The expanded Enoch narrative invites readers to imagine that unseen realities exist beyond immediate perception, where the moral choices of humanity are observed and eventually brought into alignment with divine justice. For those encountering this tradition for the first time, the realization that early believers explored these ideas can feel both fascinating and deeply thought-provoking. And for many Americans, it raises a simple question that echoes through conversations today. Why was this broader Enoch story rarely discussed when learning the Bible for the first time? When ancient readers continued reflecting on Enoch's unusual departure from the earth, they began to imagine what kind of knowledge a person might gain if taken into the presence of divine realities beyond ordinary human experience. The Book of Enoch presents this journey as a series of visions where Enoch witnesses heavenly structures, angelic responsibilities, and the moral consequences awaiting forces that attempted to disrupt the balance of creation. These descriptions are not presented casually, but with dramatic imagery intended to convey that the universe operates under a structured order where every action carries weight within a larger moral framework. Within these visions, Enoch observes celestial beings assigned to oversee elements of the natural world, suggesting a cosmic system where divine authority extends into every dimension of creation. The narrative portrays heaven not as an abstract spiritual idea, but as a structured realm filled with movement, responsibility, and accountability among the beings who inhabit it. For ancient readers, such imagery reinforced the belief that chaos on earth did not reflect the ultimate condition of reality, but rather a temporary distortion awaiting correction. This theme resonated deeply with communities facing oppression because it affirmed that injustice observed in human societies would not remain unanswered forever. Enoch's role in this vision is not as a conqueror or political leader, but as a witness who records what he sees so that future generations understand the moral structure of the universe. The emphasis on witnessing gives the narrative its unique character because Enoch becomes a bridge between human history and the hidden dimensions of divine governance. Later traditions even portray him as a scribe of heaven, carefully documenting revelations that describe both judgment and restoration within the unfolding story of creation. Such imagery reflects a profound ancient conviction that history is not random, but guided by a larger design that eventually resolves moral imbalance. For modern readers, accustomed to scientific explanations of the universe, these visions may feel symbolic rather than literal descriptions of physical locations. Yet symbolic language does not diminish the seriousness of the message, because apocalyptic literature often uses imagery to express truths about justice, responsibility, and accountability. In the Enoch tradition, corruption spreads through human society after forbidden knowledge distorts the moral order that originally governed creation. This corruption is described as violence filling the earth, echoing the Genesis account that introduces the flood narrative as a response to widespread human wrongdoing. By linking these themes together, the Enoch narrative attempts to explain why divine judgment becomes necessary within the story of early humanity, rather than presenting judgment as arbitrary. The text frames it as the restoration of balance after a period when destructive forces were allowed to spread unchecked. Ancient audiences reading this story would have recognized parallels with their own struggles against injustice and moral corruption within political systems. The promise that divine justice ultimately prevails provided reassurance that history moves toward resolution even when temporary chaos appears overwhelming. This theological structure also explains why the Enoch tradition influenced early Jewish and Christian thought about cosmic conflict and final judgment. Ideas about imprisoned rebellious angels and the ultimate defeat of evil appear in multiple texts from the Second Temple period, revealing a shared intellectual environment. When early Christian writers described spiritual rebellion and future judgment, they did so within a cultural atmosphere already familiar with these themes. The Book of Enoch therefore serves as a window into that intellectual environment rather than as a competing authority alongside canonical scripture. Understanding that context helps modern readers see how early believers developed their language about angels, divine justice, and the destiny of creation. For many Americans today, learning about this broader literary world can feel surprising because traditional church education often focuses exclusively on the canonical books themselves. That focus created clarity, but also left certain historical conversations unexplored within congregational teaching environments. As digital access expands historical awareness, more readers encounter these ancient traditions and begin asking questions about how they shaped early religious imagination. The rediscovery of Enoch therefore reflects a growing interest in understanding the cultural background surrounding the formation of biblical thought. This curiosity does not necessarily challenge faith, but often deepens appreciation for the complexity of the intellectual world in which the Bible emerged. When readers examine these traditions carefully, they see that ancient communities wrestled with many of the same moral questions that continue to shape modern society. How should power be used responsibly? And what happens when knowledge advances faster than moral wisdom capable of guiding its application? The Enoch narrative answers that question through dramatic storytelling, designed to provoke reflection rather than provide scientific explanations of early history. Its enduring influence lies in the way it frames human history within a cosmic struggle between corruption and restoration. For readers encountering this tradition for the first time, the story of Enoch becomes more than an ancient curiosity, because it reveals how deeply early believers considered the moral structure of reality. The figure who once appeared briefly within a genealogy becomes a symbol of humanity's search for understanding in a world that often feels morally unstable. And for many Americans discovering this tradition today, the most surprising realization is simply that such a rich narrative existed beyond the short Genesis reference they learned growing up. That discovery often leads to renewed interest in exploring the historical and theological environment that surrounded the earliest generations of biblical thought. In that sense, the story of Enoch continues its ancient role as an invitation to look beyond the surface of familiar texts and consider the deeper questions they quietly raise.